I know the movie was already 3 hours long, but I would have been okay with an extra 10 minutes devoted to that bongos physicist, Richard Feynman. Hey everybody, welcome to Mainely Movies. Today I'm going to be talking about the 2023 biographical historical drama, Oppenheimer. If you're new here, please consider subscribing for a variety of movie-related content like reviews, rank lists, and trailer reactions. All my reviews include a breakdown of the pros and cons, my rating, and some tailored film recommendations, so be sure to watch through to the end of this video for all of that extra content. Oppenheimer stars Cillian Murphy, Robert Downey Jr., and Matt Damon, and was directed by Christopher Nolan. It tells the story of theoretical physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer and his role in the development of the atomic bomb as part of the Manhattan Project. Although he started off small with a string of character-centric films, over the years, Christopher Nolan has become synonymous with blockbuster filmmaking. There's always been a bit of variation to these blockbusters, but when most people think of his work, one of two types of films come to mind. Either dark and gritty comic book movies, thanks to the Dark Knight trilogy, or mind and time-bending high-concept sci-fi, like Inception, Interstellar, and Tenet. Again, that's not the extent of his filmography, obviously. He's sprinkled in other types of movies since the beginning of his career, but sci-fi and action blockbusters are what he's generally known for, which makes Oppenheimer a very interesting project for him. He's previously tackled World War II with Dunkirk, but Oppenheimer is something different for him. Different, but somehow still very much in line with his filmmaking style and sensibilities. Oppenheimer is not a blockbuster. At least not in the commonly defined way. It got a summer release, and it's on track to become an extremely popular and profitable movie, but it's not your typical entertaining big-budget action movie. I don't think most people expected that, given the subject matter, but expectations might be a bit skewed because of Nolan's typical output. This is certainly still a grand epic film, but it's not a blockbuster. Instead, it's a somber amalgamation of genres and concepts. This is very much a historical drama centering around actual events and people. And although the Manhattan Project and the development of the atomic bomb are pivotal and central to the story, this is first and foremost a biopic about J. Robert Oppenheimer. It details his documented historical contributions, but it's actually more of a character study, examining his personal life and his psyche before, during, and after his involvement in the Manhattan Project. There are plenty of tense and thrilling moments, but the film also has a lot of the equivalent of courtroom drama. Obviously, with a story that revolves around the creation of a bomb, there are explosions, but that's not what this movie is. So I think it's important that people know going in that this is a largely dialogue-driven historical drama. Biopics may not be Christopher Nolan's typical genre, but Oppenheimer is still very much a Nolan film. We all know he has quite the affinity for nonlinear storytelling, incorporating it into just about every one of his films. So, unsurprisingly, he brings that nonlinear structure to this film as well. Unlike some of his sci-fi films, though, this nonlinear style isn't part of the plot, but rather a part of the presentation framework of the film. The story here is structured around two sets of hearings, a 1954 security hearing about Oppenheimer and a 1959 Senate confirmation hearing for Louis Strauss. As part of the testimony for each of these hearings, we get interspersed flashbacks that begin in 1926 and span decades of Oppenheimer's life. Unlike many historical dramas, we're rarely provided with the actual date and years to go along with these many time jumps, so much of that needs to be drawn from context and the audience's existing knowledge about the timing of some of the big events. Now, I can definitely see this structural style posing a challenge to some people, and becoming very frustrating. It certainly requires that you be an active viewer and pay attention, and it does take a bit of acclimation at the beginning of the film to get a handle on what the structure is, but once it's established, it's easy enough to follow. The audience is also helped by a very unique visual designator. Because the story covers such a wide time frame and is pulling information from a variety of testimonial sources, it could have been a very daunting task to stay on top of things. But this film identifies point of view using color. It opens in color with Oppenheimer's security hearing, and throughout the film, anytime we're experiencing the story from Oppenheimer's perspective, or looking at a more emotional, subjective take on an event, it's in color. However, Strauss's confirmation hearing opens in black and white, and anytime we're looking at things from Strauss's perspective or a more general, objective historical viewpoint, the film is in black and white. Like the nonlinear style, it takes a little bit to catch on to the significance of the color differences, but it's a very interesting and effective way to show us perspective without explicitly telling us. This structure is just one of the many impressive technical aspects of the film. Obviously, with a story that bounces around so much, editing is an extremely important part of making it all followable, but the editing goes beyond that here. Even though this is a very dialogue-based, talky film, it often prioritizes showing us something over telling it to us. This concept is used to great effect throughout the film in order to represent Oppenheimer's inner turmoil. Other films might use inner monologue or voiceover narration or something to that effect, but this film allows the performances and the editing to showcase the sometimes disjointed nature of what Oppenheimer's thinking about in a moment and what he's actually doing. The most impactful and effective of which, I think, being his speech at Los Alamos following the bombing of Hiroshima. As with most Nolan films, Oppenheimer is a technical marvel across the board. I've talked about the editing, but the cinematography, sound design, score, and any other number of technical aspects are all impressive and worthy of paragraphs of discussion apiece as well. But we're gonna keep moving, because there are other aspects of this film that are equally impressive, perhaps none more so than the performances. So this film features a lot of characters. As a biopic and a historical drama, it pulls in seemingly countless people who had a role in Oppenheimer's life and or the development of the atomic bomb. There are probably 4 or 5 main characters here, but dozens and dozens of secondary, tertiary, and quaternary characters. Like the structure of the film, the sheer number of characters takes some getting used to, and could prove potentially confusing to some people, especially if you're not paying attention or you're just not really good with faces. Because there are so many characters here, it's tough to individually highlight most of the performances, even though many of them are excellent. Smaller roles like David Krumholtz as Isidore Robbie, or Alden Ehrenreich as Strauss's aide, or Jason Clarke as Roger Robb, but also the bigger roles, Florence Pugh, Matt Damon, Emily Blunt, Robert Downey Jr. All of them were excellent here, and some of them are probably going to be getting Oscar nominations. But the standout here, unsurprisingly, is Cillian Murphy as J. Robert Oppenheimer. The depth of his performance is outstanding. He's able to convey the brilliance of Oppenheimer, but also just how deeply conflicted and haunted he was in both his personal and professional life. As a film, Oppenheimer is able to accomplish something unexpected. Yes, it's a 3-hour-long biopic drama that manages to remain extremely engaging throughout, which is not always the norm, but it manages to do that with largely unlikable characters and a very controversial historical event. And I think it does this by never losing focus on Oppenheimer himself. The world knows him as the father of the atomic bomb for his role in the Manhattan Project, and this film explores that. But as a biopic, as a character study, it's more about the man himself. So the scope of the film, despite being epic and grand, is still fairly limited. It's not a comprehensive look at World War II, or at nuclear warfare, or even atomic testing, but it is a compelling and thought-provoking look into Oppenheimer. Into his character, his reservations, his sense of duty, but also his extreme inner turmoil, and especially his haunted, devastated sense of responsibility, not only in the immediate aftermath of the creation of the atomic bomb and its use during World War II, but also in the longer term, as he sees the world-changing trajectory and destructive consequences of his scientific contributions. Oppenheimer is a densely packed film, but it's also a heavy one that settles on you and doesn't ever really go away. Alright, let's talk about the pros and cons. Pro number 1 is the performances. There are a lot of characters in this film, so it'd be impossible for me to highlight every single good performance here, but they were exceptionally strong regardless of if they were only featured in a single scene or they were portraying the title character of the film. This movie is chock full of big-name actors, but I've gotta say, in nearly every case, I never saw the actor in a role. I saw the character. Everybody really melted into their roles, which is an impressive feat, especially at such a large scale. There are a number of award-worthy performances here, like Robert Downey Jr. and Emily Blunt, but the clear standout is Cillian Murphy as Oppenheimer. He obviously looks the part with that gaunt facial structure and those haunted eyes, but he also plays the part phenomenally well. He's got a lot of lines, but he also does a lot with body language, expression, and even just his eyes. Oppenheimer is a complex and very internally tormented character, and Murphy portrays that with masterful skill and depth. The second pro has got to be the technical elements. So I could break this up into 3 or 4 different pros with how impressive the individual elements are, but for time's sake, I'm combining them as a collective aspect of the film. Christopher Nolan's movies are almost always technically impressive, so I'm sure this doesn't really surprise anybody, but Oppenheimer is just as impressive as one would expect. This film uses both color and black and white photography, which have different requirements to be successfully shot. Lighting, contrast, etc. But the cinematography here is wonderful in both instances. The score and sound design add a lot to the story and its impact, but the editing really takes it all to the next level, both in terms of sound editing and film editing. Not only does the editing make the nonlinear structure comprehensible, but it also works in conjunction with Cillian Murphy's performance to really showcase the inner turmoil of Robert Oppenheimer. Pro number 3 is the approach. There are a lot of different ways that you could come at this story, and a lot of different ways that it could be framed. Robert Oppenheimer is certainly not a historical figure without controversy, and a film about him, very understandably, could have focused on his actions and his role in the Manhattan Project and development of the atomic bomb. This film certainly includes that, but it expands the focus beyond just his actions. This is a character study, so we get insight into everything. The personal aspects of his life, like his relationships and inner torment, even prior to his atomic work, but also into his psyche during and after his work on the Manhattan Project. His reservations and concerns, the moral dilemmas he and many other scientists grappled with, and then the haunted, devastated sense of responsibility for what others ultimately did with his work. This could have been a very run-of-the-mill information dump kind of biopic, but instead it's something much more impactful. Haunting and heavy, but thought-provoking and existential. On the con side, my only issues are really just minor nitpicks, and I hesitate to even call them cons, because most of them are more mixed aspects than definitively negative ones. The first element of this has to do with the scope of the film. Again, I liked the approach, and that it focuses on Oppenheimer rather than World War II or nuclear warfare more broadly, but even with the Oppenheimer focus, this is a very expansive story, pulling in 4 decades worth of personal and professional events in Oppenheimer's life, plus a ton of characters. Now, obviously, it's a challenge when creating a story about real-life events and real-life people, but at times it felt like the scope was a little more expansive than really necessary here. A somewhat related mixed nitpick has to do with the structure of the film. Now, I like the nonlinear style and the visual differentiation between the subjective and objective viewpoints within the story, but it is complex. It has a bit of a learning curve and takes some time for the audience to work out the structure. So that combined with the sheer number of characters can make it a little tough to keep track of things early on. That'll definitely be less of a factor on rewatch, but it does impact the initial viewing some. Before I give you my rating and recommendations, I want to remind you that if you're interested in buying Oppenheimer or any of the other films I mentioned today, I do have affiliate links for all of them in the description below. I get a small commission from anything you buy using one of my links, so I'd really appreciate it if you use them if you're in the market for any of these movies. I'm gonna give Oppenheimer 4 out of 5 paws, though I wouldn't be surprised if this jumps up an extra half paw for me on rewatch. It's structurally complex and crams an awful lot of people and events into 3 hours, but it manages to be both an engaging and haunting biopic, as well as a technical marvel that leaves you with heavy existential thoughts of morality, responsibility, science, and history. I would recommend Oppenheimer to people who enjoy history or those who like character study dramas. On the history side, this film offers an interesting and fast-paced look into one of the most monumental, world-changing endeavors that humans have ever undertaken, without ever falling into documentary information dumping. But at the same time, this is an extended exploration of Robert Oppenheimer and his psyche throughout that same historical time period. It's a dense, long film, but it flies by if you have an interest in the subject or biopic drama style. However, if you don't have those interests, this could be a long, draining experience. If you liked Oppenheimer, I would recommend Failsafe. This is an exceptionally tense Cold War thriller that centers around an international nuclear crisis. It's a fictional exploration of one of the potential scenarios that haunted Oppenheimer in the years after his work on the Manhattan Project, and it's another very impactful film that'll sit with you long after you finish watching. If you're interested in another Christopher Nolan film, you might want to watch Dunkirk. It's another historical World War II drama that utilizes an interesting temporal structure. However, it is far less character-based, focusing more on the events of the Dunkirk evacuation than it does on any specific character. And if you're interested in another biopic about a scientist who became somewhat haunted by the consequences of their work, you should check out Radioactive. It focuses on the life of Marie Curie and her discovery of and work on radioactivity. It's a more traditionally structured biopic than Oppenheimer, but it's another tale about the positive and negative consequences of a scientific discovery. Alright, a couple questions for you guys. Number 1, have you seen Oppenheimer? If so, what'd you think of it? And number 2, what's your favorite biopic? Be sure to leave your answers in the comments below so we can get a discussion going. Alright, so if you got some enjoyment, insight, or information on this review, I'd appreciate it if you'd hit that like button. And if you haven't done so already, please hit subscribe while you're at it to see more videos like this. Till next time, this has been Alyssa with Mainely Movies. The way life should be.